Hey everyone, it's Jody Sutter of the Sutter Company, and welcome back to Just Ask Jody live on LinkedIn. I'm flying solo today. Normally I've got my teammate Megan, who is in the background managing things like transitions, hence the reason why I was a little bit slow after the intro to join you all here for those of us who are here. Always good to be back with you guys. And if you're watching this on the recording, always glad to have you folks watching the recording as well. So today we've got, I think, a really interesting topic. I guess I always think they're interesting. I love agency new business. And so I tend to invite people on to this little event here who have some great things to talk about as it bears on agency new business. Today we're talking about recurring revenue. And I've got a great guest named Karl Sakas, who's an agency growth expert. He and I have a lot of similarities in what we do, and yet we also diverge in some really interesting ways. And so I think he's a really big compliment to what you often hear from me. And I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation. So I'm going to bring Karl on in a minute. Let me tell you just a little bit about him really quickly. So I'm going to read from his bio, so full disclosure, reading some prepared notes here. Karl helps digital agency owners work less and earn more. In fact, that's the name of his new book, Work Less and Earn More. So he helps them work less and earn more while creating professional growth opportunities for agency employees as well. Drawing on his background in agency operations, Karl has personally advised hundreds of agencies on every inhabited continent. I can't quite say that yet, so that's pretty impressive to me. He's an international speaker, and as I said, he is the author of Work Less and Earn More. I believe that's the fourth book on agency growth and agency operations that he's written, and I'm going to add Karl here to the stream. Welcome, Karl. Thank you so much for being here.
Jody, great to be here and looking forward to helping everyone.
Yeah. And by the way, for the folks who are here, like I said, usually Megan is here to help me out, but please post comments, post questions to Karl. I've got a list of questions that I would like to ask him. I'm just telling him that usually these events start. I've got a bunch of questions, and then we find some really interesting routes and we go down and often have nothing to do with the questions that I prepared. But please do add comments, add questions, and I will do my best to keep my eyes peeled to those and to answer them as quickly as possible. So, Karl, recurring revenue, I've got kind of an obvious sounding question to start. And that
Sure.
is, what exactly is recurring revenue? How do you define recurring revenue?
There are a few ways to look at it, but at its base, recurring revenue is revenue from clients that is coming in on an ongoing cadence. Most likely it's monthly, it could be quarterly, it could be annually. The idea is that clients have agreed to keep paying you for some period of time. The opposite would be a single project, where you do a project, you get paid for the project or a particular campaign, and that's it. And it's up to you to sell them on continuing. Whereas with a retainer, people will sign a retainer, usually 6 to 12 months, sometimes longer, and you're going to negotiate a renewal, but you don't, in theory, have to worry about the revenue as long as the retainer, the recurring revenue, is in place.
Right. And actually, that was one of a few sub questions, which is there a difference between a retainer and recurring revenue?
I would say a retainer contributes to recurring revenue.
Okay. And do agencies even want recurring revenue? You know, but I think I have my answer, and based on the way you described recurring revenue, I anticipate that most agencies would say yes. But let me be a little naive. Why do we want recurring revenue?
There are pros and cons. Most agencies in my work, and this is with hundreds of agencies all over the world, agencies tend to want at least some degree of recurring revenue. It
Yeah.
may not be 100%, but often it's a majority. And the reason is around stability.
Yeah.
You're having to pay your team on a recurring basis. It's a recurring expense, hopefully an investment, but ultimately you're paying your team recurring basis. It's a lot easier to plan for your growth if you know that revenue will be recurring as well.
Right.
Otherwise, you might be scrambling and trying to get revenue in to cover your team or needing to do a layoff or something along those lines. So there are a lot of benefits around stability. The challenge becomes once you've committed to fulfill a retainer, you now have to fulfill the retainer. you need staffing to get it done, and you need to make sure that you're doing the work that you've committed to do. So
Right.
a lot of benefits in terms of the stability side of things and predictability, potentially less firefighting. Talk
Yeah.
about the idea of going from being the firefighter to the fire marshal, preventing the
Hmm.
fires in the future. But you are on the hook to deliver the work, whether that's through employees, contractors, or a mix.
So, especially for agencies that maybe are still figuring out how to bring recurring revenue into their business model. I mean,
Yes.
again, I would be thinking like, no problem, I'll figure it out. Good problem to
Mhm.
have.
Yep.
Um, what are some of the things that you see? What are some of the problems that arise that agencies who do not have a lot of recurring revenue tend to run into when they are successful getting some recurring revenue?
Well, I'd start by asking yourself, do you want recurring revenue? There are a lot of benefits, but again, you're going to be on the hook to fulfill the work.
Hmm.
A related piece, do your current and future clients want services that can be delivered via recurring revenue?
Right.
Some of your clients might be totally fine to keep hiring you on an ongoing basis, but they don't want the commitment of a retainer contract. Can you profitably deliver recurring revenue? It's great to be able to sell it
Mm,
if people want it, but can you do it profitably? And then finally, can you actually sell it? It's a bit of a different conversation.
right. So I want to divide up the selling it, and I'm jotting a couple of
Mhm.
notes because I think these are important points, and I remember.
Yeah.
So, how do you determine if you can profitably deliver recurring revenue? Do you have any sort of formula, or are there even just some key benchmarks or key indicators that you should have in place?
In general, agencies are ideally spending 50 to 60% of their revenue on labor, and that
Mhm.
includes the owner or owners, as well
Mhm.
as employees and kind of ongoing contractors, someone who's
Okay.
working with you, every week, that kind of
Right.
thing. That leaves an additional, if you're assuming overhead, you're ultimately going to leave 20 to 30% for net margins. So in that sense, if your gross profit margins, that is what you're paying directly to fulfill the work, is in the neighborhood of 50 to 60%. Some people shoot lower, but 50 to
Mm,
60% can be a good target. If you can get that done, you're probably in good shape. Now, ideally, if you're having to hire contractors to fulfill the retainer services initially, ideally you're able to double whatever you pay the contractors. So say you're paying them 75 an hour, you're billing them at least
150.
150 an
Yeah.
hour, although more is okay. If you have employees doing it, ideally it's more like tripling it. Say you're paying someone the equivalent of $60 an hour, fully loaded, you're ideally billing them at 180 an hour
Okay.
or more.
So
So that would
$60 an hour is including their healthcare and any other benefits that you include in the
Yeah,
package.
so like a 60 an hour person would be roughly 120,000 a year.
Yeah.
The full cost would depend on, your benefits and
Yeah.
which country geography you're in and things like that. But as a rough idea.
Yeah.
For instance, though, if you're selling a service that, maybe you can only bill $150 an hour, which would generally be on the lower side,
Yeah.
and you have to pay $100 an hour to get the work done, your margins are not going to be good. And that's probably either not the right service to fulfill. I mean, this is true on a project basis as well,
Right.
but certainly for retainers, or you may need to find people who can fulfill the work at a lower cost.
Yeah. Gosh, I've got so many questions going through my head. Going back to
Yeah,
like selling recurring revenue, I want to ask about
yeah,
that because I also wonder too. There's a selling it, but also selling it to your employees or your freelancers. So
yes.
is it sometimes important in order to do with the work profitably, but
Mhm.
maybe you're not in a position to take on full-time employees? Is there a bit of salesmanship around um, convincing a freelancer that you're willing to commit to them for a certain amount of time and they maybe negotiate their rate for a 18-month project or an 18-month engagement versus like a 3-month? Is that ever something you recommend?
If they're open to it, definitely.
Right.
And the
Okay.
key thing there is that ideally you are matching your labor model to your services model as to how you're delivering the work. For instance,
Hmm.
it's risky to do a retainer that happens to be at a fixed price for a fixed scope, you can do retainers on a bucket of hours basis. But if you're saying, we'll do this fixed amount of work for a fixed price, but you're paying your team on an hourly basis, if you
Right.
don't have caps on how many hours people are spending, you could
Yeah.
easily lose money if the work ends up being harder than you thought to fulfill.
Gotcha. So what kind of work is ideally suited to recurring revenue?
Ongoing marketing services are the most typical situation. That could
Mhm.
be search engine optimization. It could be something related to, say, pay-per-click advertising, where there's maybe a base amount that people pay. It might
Yeah.
go up depending on the overall spend. Could be things related to social media marketing, where someone is the social media, whether it's agency of record or otherwise, things like that. Could be content marketing. Also going
Pushing out
beyond
that
video.
content, filling the content machine. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. Going beyond the digital side of things, public relations. PR is increasingly digital, but, traditionally it has not been.
Yeah.
That's the case where, if someone wants the benefits of PR, they're not going to get that from a 1 month engagement, right? It's
Right.
typically an ongoing sort of thing. There are some services that are harder to connect to
Mhm.
recurring services. For a long time, video services was one of those, though conveniently video tends to be pretty good from a marketing impact. I mean, here we
Right.
are on video, right? People will be able to
Yeah.
find the video and benefit from the advice we're sharing. And if they
And
want
I
more
think it's
help,
a little like a content machine. Like you
yeah,
gotta once you
yeah.
start using video, especially digitally for your marketing, you kind of want to keep the momentum going.
Exactly.
You
So
want,
smart video production firms have leveraged recurring services. It's not just shooting the video, it's how to help clients leverage that. So there's that. One area where agencies sometimes struggle is around for branding oriented agencies, where, if it's like, we'll build a brand for you, well, hopefully clients aren't doing that every month, right? A new,
right?
a new brand every month.
Yeah.
Though there are opportunities. For instance, I
Yeah.
worked with a client, this is one of the case studies on my website, Big Vision, an agency based in Florida. And when we started working together, 10% of the revenue was recurring. And in my analysis of things and speaking with the owner, that was a
Mhm.
key priority. They wanted to boost
Yeah.
the recurring revenue. And so we started by looking at a number of things, but one of those was, are they delivering any services initially that could be sold on a recurring basis? In their case, there were. They weren't starting totally from scratch. If, on the other hand, an agency had no recurring services, you're going to have to sort that out. But
Yeah.
ultimately, we did an iterative approach and also an agency-wide approach. That meant in the sales process, the salesperson at Big Vision would be talking about future recurring opportunities. I mean, not framing it exactly as that, but hey, once we help you build or revamp your brand, there are other ways we can help you increase the impact of that.
And is that
And
happening as they're pitching that initial scope, or is that happening after? Is that an ongoing sales
all of that,
relationship?
all of that. So
Okay.
it's happening in the sales process so that the
Mhm.
salesperson isn't just selling the initial project. The
Yeah.
framing is, and there's more that we can do to help to build
Yeah.
momentum, but also happening in the onboarding process, happening during ongoing account management. For instance, oh, that's a great idea, or this is a general advice in that. Oh, that's a great idea. That might be something to handle in the post-launch retainer. It's not part of the current scope,
Right.
but we're glad to add that to the backlog of things later. Also, in account management, it's important. And it's important that generally also the strategists on the team are aware of this as a priority. So ultimately, by everyone at the agency making it a priority, that if the client would benefit from recurring services, make sure the client knows about it. And ultimately, thanks to that focus and thanks to making it a priority, the agency in about a year grew revenue 10% recurring to 90%
Oh
recurring
my
without.
gosh, wow, that's a huge jump.
Yes, and
Um,
it's very fast. Like, most people aren't
yeah.
going to do it that fast, but it
Yeah, yeah,
starts
yeah.
by committing to do it.
Well, I love the fact that you start with what's already there. So let's look
Yes.
at what, and I think probably for anyone listening to this, if they want to move towards recurring, First of all, they should get in touch with Carl, and we'll be telling you how to contact him at the end of this.
Yeah.
But is to look at what they're doing, what you're doing now that
Mhm.
could easily, logically be converted into recurring. Let me ask you also about selling, because this is something that I work with a lot on my clients and coach them through. I talk to a lot of agency owners who have conversations that go kind of like this.
Mhm.
I wish I could get my team to sell more. Like, I tell them
Mhm.
to bring up to listen for those opportunities,
Yep.
and yet they don't always take it. So, and I've got, I think that a lot of it has to do with training. I think a lot of it has to do with just having those regular conversations, making it part of the culture.
Yeah.
Um, as the agency owner, managing director, or leader, being there to um, not so much monitor, but to sort of be a collaborator with them. You're not, as I say, you're not like sending them out to the woods, into the wilderness with a
Right.
compass and a granola bar, right? You're saying, like, you're talking about it, and you're working through strategy, and you're working through the communications, and who you're talking to at that company, and who you need to be talking to. I'd love to hear a little bit about what you recommend for really making that sort of, operationalizing that.
A lot of it is about mindset, helping the
Mhm.
team understand
Yeah,
that sales is about helping clients match up what the agency can do to help them
yeah,
with what the client needs. And
yeah.
part of that, I think, is there's some stigma about sales, where if your perception of
Yes.
sales is back in the day, walking into Radio Shack and you've got the commission salespeople.
I wonder how
I
many
was
people are
surprised.
listening to this going, "What's Radio Shack?"
I did see a billboard for Radio Shack the other day.
Like, really?
It looked fairly new. But,
Okay.
in that case, or it's true for any, say, buying a car, any situation
Yeah.
outside of, say, CarMax, where the salespeople are working solely on commission, people just descend on you and they're
Yeah.
pushing, pushing. It's more transactional, kind of thing. In the Radio Shack
Yeah.
example, it's, I just want to buy some batteries. Like, I don't
Right.
want to buy
Yeah.
the latest thing. The reality is that agency sales is more consultative, right? It's helping clients
Yeah.
solve problems. And if the agency can help, great. So part of that is mindset, that sales is not sleazy, it's not hurting the client. You're trying to figure out if there's a match. If
Yeah.
there's not a match, that's fine. So part of that is a mindset
Right.
about sales is helping the client when you do it
I
right.
agree.
Cost
I
inflation.
agree, and I also think we're getting a little bit away from the topic of recurring revenue and actually going
Sure.
back to the perennial topic of how are you positioned, and what's your messaging
Yeah.
strategy, and how are you communicating value? Because I think that there's a lot there around communicating value. What I
Yeah.
found is that even the most um, trepidatious agency team member, if they have got a really clear message about how they provide value,
Mhm.
that's like the best way to shed all the mindset issues, because now they're not begging. They're
Yeah.
saying, like, "Hey, look, you look hungry, and I can give you a really healthy, satisfying meal that's going to be a great investment for you. For not too much money. Actually, let's skip the money part. You should never, for a high value
Mhm.
for a high output." Um, so yeah, is that something that you also recommend when you're talking with agencies about this?
That's definitely a helpful angle.
Yeah.
And, if we're thinking about getting the whole team trained to support the sales process,
Yes. Yeah.
part of that is sharing anecdotes anonymized about other clients. Something
Sure.
comes up with a client. Ideally, you're saying, "Oh, we ran into this last week with a firm similar to yours, in another state or in a different industry," or, like, they don't want to hear about their direct competitors, but
Yeah.
kind of thing. And, we were able to sort that out. If you're interested, I can either bring our
That's
strategist in or bring the salesperson in to see
Oh
if,
my
if
gosh.
you
And
benefit
now
from.
you're getting into case studies, which are also such a
Yeah.
basic new business tool.
Yeah.
And that's also beyond, I think you also, like me, you work with smaller agencies, but it's taking
Typically under 100 people. Yeah.
but still 100 gets to a point where you must proactively um, sort of syndicate these stories so that everyone
Yeah.
knows about them.
Yes. It is worth considering when it comes to enlisting employees outside of the executive team,
Yeah.
outside of the sales team to help sell. Some people are just never going to do it. They're just never going to feel comfortable
I
about
agree.
it.
Yeah.
But if you haven't trained people, and you might also consider having a modest
Yeah.
incentive program. Maybe it's, oh, a client
Mm,
mentioned something, share a heads up to the designated person at the agency, and maybe there's a small bonus tied to that.
yeah.
You want people listening for it,
Yeah.
but if people aren't doing it and you haven't given them the tools they need, well, that's kind of your fault as the agency leader. But you can
Right.
fix it.
A lot is taken for granted. And I think part of it is because it seems so obvious. Like, well, we did the work. Of course they should know about that great campaign we did, or that great work that we did for the client. And it's not
Yeah.
always obvious for the folks. Let's get back to recurring revenue though.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that your client that went from 10% recurring to 90% recurring. Wow.
Yeah.
Um, but do you have any sort of a ratio for the ideal ratio between recurring and project based revenue?
There's not an ideal
Yeah.
specific number or percentage. It really comes down to
Yeah.
the agency owner or owner's goals.
Yeah.
But if you want the business to be more stable, more fire marshal and less firefighting,
Yeah.
recurring revenue can help. You still have to be careful about a client concentration problem, which I
Right.
define as any one client being 20% or more of your annual revenue.
Mm,
That's a danger, right? If you've got a
yeah.
client that's, say, half your revenue and you lose them, whether it's recurring or project based, that's a problem. An advantage of having, ideally you don't have client concentration, but if it's client concentration and it's a locked in retainer, you would at least know when the retainer ends
Sure.
and can take steps before the end of the retainer to try to renew it, ideally grow it as well, rather than suddenly finding, well, the project is ending and they don't need more help,
Mm,
or they're not persuaded they want more help, or things like that. So at least even with client concentration, if it's a retainer for thus recurring revenue, you can plan accordingly.
yeah. Whose job is it typically to renew the retainer contract? Or do
Usually
you recommend?
usually the account manager, but the account manager could be multiple people. So in
Okay.
my work, I've identified 6 agency roles: account
Hmm.
management, project management, your subject matter expert, SMEs, so be like designers, developers, analysts, writers, things like that.
Okay.
Strategist, client strategist is sort of like a super SME with a
Hmm.
side of account management. Their job is to maximize the client's budget, ROI. So they've
That's a
got a
great way of
certain
looking at
amount,
it.
how do we best spend that budget? That's the strategist. And then you've also got biz dev, which I define as 3 things: marketing, sales, and partnerships. And then finally support, which is operations and leadership, keep the agency running smoothly, both short and long
Yeah.
term. So
Yeah.
account management, different people could wear the AM hat. It could be the owner. Typically, when the agency is smaller, the owner will be the account manager. Could
Yeah.
be someone with an AM title. It could also be someone with a project manager title, but who is
Mm,
heavily client facing. And I had a job like that where I had a PM title at the agency, but I was
yeah.
also the day to day client contact kind of thing. So usually the account manager will. There are some agencies that will bring back the salesperson who sold the agreement initially to
Yeah.
do the upsell. I worked in an agency there where I was responsible for kind of day-to-day upsells, but if it was selling them something, the size of the original engagement, we would bring in the salesperson to help.
Did that work
So
well?
it did, yeah, because I was able to focus on fulfilling the work that we had sold already,
Hmm.
and then he could get involved thinking about helping the client think about all these possibilities. So
Yeah.
it was a good division of labor, and
Yeah.
also, I mean, it was a good partnership. He was not as detail oriented as I was, so I was able to help him out with that. So it helps to
Nice.
have a
You
good
complemented each
partnership.
other. I love
Yes,
hearing that.
yes.
Excellent. Okay, so no real balance, but I think going back, circling back to the start of that question too, that answer, I do think that I agree the danger of having a client that is a disproportionate amount of your total revenue. And also, I think that sometimes agencies can get a little complacent or they shy away. That's one of the reasons why I was asking about who should renew, because they may shy away from the renewal, or it's sort of like, okay, time to renew the contract. Let's just put it in front of them and hope they sign, as opposed
Yeah.
to using it as an opportunity to not only say, here's what we did for you this year, but like, here's where we maybe fell short. Here's where we believe we could have done better. Here's where we felt like we weren't able to perform as well.
Yes.
Getting out some of those difficult conversations, being the ones to bring them up first so that you can address them. And I think that's also,
Yeah.
for me, I suppose that would be a hazard of recurring revenue if you're not willing, along with delivering the work profitably, also
Mhm.
being willing to manage it like as a skilled account manager would.
Absolutely. I am a
Yeah.
fan of doing ongoing check-ins, sharing the impact of things.
Yeah.
I do that, for instance, in my executive coaching services, where it's month to month. People can
Okay.
stop anytime they want, but I have clients who've done coaching for years because
Yeah.
they're getting value. And
That's
part
great.
of that is to do a formal check-in every 6 months about, okay, when they
Okay. Yeah.
started, they said, Here's where they wanted to be a year in the future and also
Yeah.
5 years in the future." I'll say, "What's on track for your 1 year goals?
Yeah.
Uh, what's working, what's not, what will you change in terms of what you're doing toward those goals?" And often a lot of things are on track. There's some things they want to change. There's some things that may be off track, but it's also an opportunity to talk through that of like, what do we do
Yeah.
next
Yeah.
as they're growing. Usually it's something came up along the way and we've had to
Yeah.
shift and deal with that. But I do that every 6 months, and that's helpful to reinforce the
Yeah.
value and get things reset.
Yeah. I think a lot of agencies they're so fearful of being fired. Probably because their new business pipeline isn't strong enough. But what
Yeah.
I've also found is that more often than not, when I've had those difficult conversations, whether it's in my business now, I shouldn't even say difficult, but when I've had those vulnerable conversations, whether it's my business now or
Yes.
when I was working on staff at agencies, it
Mhm.
usually resulted in a stronger relationship, renewal of the contract, a bigger contract.
Yes.
Yeah.
It it it
Um,
it can't hurt. Like, if a client is unhappy, they know they're unhappy.
yeah.
Calling it out, as you said, if you're the first one to bring it up, there's a lot of power in that, and sometimes that's exactly what you need to get the client re-engaged and re-enlisted, and you
Yeah.
can grow from there.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. So we're almost at the end. We've covered a lot. We've talked about, sort of what recurring revenue is, why you might want it, some of the hazards of over relying on it or not managing it well. Again, recurring revenue. I think sometimes agencies will feel like I just need more. I get this a lot. I want more retainer clients. I'm like,
Yeah,
okay, but now you have to build those skills to manage that as well. So you got
yeah,
to, it's a different set of skills. It's not going to answer all your prayers. It's a positive thing in general, but you still have to polish off and work on your sales skills. You got to make sure that your team, we've talked about sort of incorporating your entire team so that everyone is listening for those recurring revenue opportunities, those selling
yeah.
opportunities, and how important that ties into mindset. Um, is there anything, I'm going to borrow a question that one of my favorite podcasts is the 10% Happier podcast. I think I've shouted it out here before. And one of the things that Dan Harris asks at the end is, and I thought I'm going to steal is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you today? Isn't that a great
I would
question?
I would say, if you're an agency owner, you'll want to think about, what do you want from your agency in general? 'Cause if your agency
Mm,
is off
wow,
track
good
from
question.
your long-term goals, I mean, it's a more existential question.
Yeah.
Fix that first. Recurring revenue may be a solution. In my Work Less, Earn More book, recurring revenue is one of the 25 growth tactics that I've
Right.
identified and share in the book. But make sure you know where you want to go, because
Yeah.
otherwise you may not end up where you want to be.
Right. So in other words, if you're focused on, if you're not willing to invest the time in the bigger question, where do I want my business to go, you are going to continue sort of running on that treadmill, trying to fill that pipeline and recurring revenue. Not that it's bad or good in and of itself, but it may
Right.
not actually be. It may just getting you further into a situation that's not ideal for you to fulfill that long term vision.
Make sure you're
That
solving the real problem.
Yeah, yeah, that's that is a great insight and a great piece of advice. And what a way to end our half an hour
Yeah.
together. Carl, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, and as you showed, you've got a new book, Work Less, Earn More, and that is available, I assume, on Amazon.
Available on Amazon,
Yeah,
hardcover, paperback, Kindle, and coming out shortly, the audio version on
nice.
Audible. Yeah,
Are
so if
you
you go to
do you read it, or did you get like
yeah,
Mel Gibson or
yeah,
someone, or like or Shelley
yeah,
Waldron?
narrated myself or in the
Nice.
midst of finalizing things.
Yeah.
So the plan is for that to come out in September of 2023.
Fantastic. And then the other thing I just put up here on a banner, if Carl, so just a personal note to anyone who's listening to this, I have found that Carl has been extremely generous, not only at what I observe as a objective third party, but Carl, you've also just been generous with me, and hopefully I've been able to reciprocate. But for anyone who doesn't know Carl well, and we have one comment, I'm going to go in there to see. Oh, Adam, thank you. Great session. Um,
Thanks.
so yeah, anyone who doesn't know Carl, so generous with his insights and his experience and his knowledge. So lots of stuff on his website at sakasandcompany.com. And also, can they just get in touch with you by email as well if they're interested in
Sure,
learning
they're welcome.
more and
Yeah.
working with you? And I assume also on that website they'll be able to find out more about how to get the book as well, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and if you want to go directly to the book, that's at worklessearnmorebook.com. That'll give you all of the international purchase links. You can get a sample chapter. There's a 40 plus page free workbook that goes with the book to help you apply
Oh,
things. So that's all at worklessearnmorebook.com. But you can see more at the main site too.
wow. That's pretty great, Carl. Thank you so much. Has the book been? I mean, it came out a few months ago. Has it been going really well for you?
It's gotten a good response.
Good.
People have mentioned that it's changed how they think about their agency and also
Excellent.
gives them the structure to make it happen, and also
Yeah.
realize that they're not the only person struggling with some of the challenges they're
Yeah.
facing.
Yeah.
Being any kind of business owner, but an agency owner in particular, you've got humans all around you, your clients and your team, and humans are complicated. You're delivering work that clients often have some subjective opinions about whether it's good or if it's even done.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And a lot of agency owners are accidental business owners, yet their families depending on them for the agency to succeed. It's a tough spot.
That's right.
That's why I wrote the book, to help make things better, both for owners and to help create opportunities for their team to get promoted as well.
Yeah. Well, Carl, thank you so much, and everyone, please do get in touch with him. He's really such a just a font of great information. And Carl, I'd love to have you back, and hopefully we'll be talking again soon. Thank you so much.